Hello, I'm Richard Blackaby, and I want to welcome all of you at North Sea Baptist Church. I had intended to be with you in person this morning. Your pastor had invited me to come and speak to the men in a retreat, and then to be preaching this morning with you in your church live. And when he suggested that perhaps I just do something virtually for you, I thought that would be not the best alternative, but certainly better than nothing. And so I am glad to be able to be with you this morning. So many of you perhaps remember my brother Tom that was pastor there a number of years ago, and my son Daniel that served there for several months as working with the youth. I've been at your church, I think, 3 times in the past, and had so look forward to being with you this weekend as well. And my wife, I believe, has been there, and my daughter has also been there. So you're held very warmly in our hearts. And I appreciate so much your pastor and the church members I've met over the years. And hopefully a time will work out soon when I can return and be with you in person. But this morning I thought I would just share with you a few thoughts. I wonder how many of you have ever had a difficult exam. Can you remember an exam, a test that you had that was just far more difficult than anything that you'd ever experienced before? I've spent a lot of years in school. I've earned several degrees, and so I've had a lot of tests over the years. And for the most part, I was fairly good at taking tests. I could usually figure out what the teacher probably wanted and try to recall as much as I could from the lectures and put it down on a test paper. But I remember when I was in seminary, the first 2 years had gone well. I had gotten very good grades. I had done very well in the exams. But this was a particularly difficult class. It was Hebrew, and I'm no good at languages. And I was preparing to enter the PhD program. And so I had Hebrew class from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And then from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock, I had German, which putting Hebrew and German back to back was just a great trial for someone that was no good at languages. And my Hebrew professor was a godly man, but he had very ungodly exams. And I did not know that until I took his first exam. And he had this terrible habit of giving you twice as much material that you could possibly cover in 1 hour on the exam. I learned later that he expected you to stay for at least an extra hour or 2 to finish his exam. The problem was I had a German exam in the very next hour. And so when I sat down for my hour-long Hebrew exam, I began to look at all the translation he wanted me to do, and I realized I could never get through it in time. And for the first time in my life, I began to panic. I think I came as close as I ever have to having a panic attack. And I began to not think clearly and to forget things. And I was trying to frantically translate this material, but I couldn't find certain words. It didn't make sense to me. And of course, then you get more upset and frustrated. And before I knew it, the hour was gone. I had to leave and get to my next exam. I maybe had finished half of the exam, and everyone else around me was remaining there for another hour to finish the exam, but I couldn't. I had to leave. I got a very low grade on that exam, the lowest grade actually I ever earned in seminary, and it was a very humbling time for me. I thought at that time that was the most difficult exam I'd ever had. But when I finished that class, I had to take the entrance exam for the PhD program, and that exam was 13 hours. I'd never had a 13-hour exam before. But if I were going to enter the PhD program, I had to endure a 13-hour exam. And I remember it was a 2-day-long affair. By the second day, I was getting physically sick. My nose was running. I started to cough. My eyes were watering. And by the end of that 13th hour, I literally was stumbling out of the room, hardly able to see. My eyes were watering so profusely. I was coughing and sick. I was sick for 2 weeks after that exam. But it let me get into a level of studies that I'd never been in before. And then when I thought that I could never have a more difficult exam, when I finished all my seminars for my PhD program, I had to take a 3-hour oral exam, and all my professors entered into a room. Any one of them could ask me a question that could have failed me, and I knew that, and they knew that. And it was 3 hours of just living right on the edge, just dreading that if they ask me a question I can't answer, what's going to happen. And so over the course of my life, I've had several exams that were very difficult, and each of them I wasn't sure that I would pass. But each time that I did pass, it opened up a doorway to a whole nother level of living, of studying, and of leading. And I find that in life, there will be those tests that will come. And how you handle that test will determine what God does for you next. And certainly those of us around the world who've just been through or going through COVID-19, we've experienced a test. All of our different areas in our life, whether it's our family life, our church life, our spiritual life, our work life, has all been tested. And for some people, they've passed the test very well. And it's been very pleasing to see that they were able to withstand all the pressures and changes and difficulties that came. But for other people, it's been a bit disappointing to see the stress it put on their marriage or on their family or on their walk with God. And I want to talk to you for a moment about just some of the testing times that will determine in large part what God will do in your life. And there's a wonderful story that's found in Luke chapter 19. When you turn to Luke 19, you remember the first 10 verses are talking about Zacchaeus, that wonderful story of the tax collector that is marvelously saved by Jesus. But when you get to the end of that story and you turn to verse 11, it says, "Now, as they heard these things, he spoke another parable, because he was near Jerusalem, and because they thought the kingdom of God would appear immediately." So Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. That's why he's passed through Jericho. And so as they're approaching Jerusalem, people assume, well, the end times have come and the kingdom of God will be ushered in. And so Jesus tells this parable to try to address some of their misunderstandings. And he says, "Therefore a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and to return. So he called 10 of his servants, delivered to them 10 minas, and said to them, 'Do business till I come.' But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, 'We will not have this man to reign over us.' And so it was that when he returned, having received the kingdom, he then commanded these servants, to whom he had given the money, to be called to him, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading. Then came the first, saying, 'Master, your mina has earned 10 minas more.' And he said to him, 'Well done, good servant, because you were faithful in a very little, have authority over 10 cities. And the second came, saying, 'Master, your mina has earned 5 minas.' Likewise he said to him, 'You also be over 5 cities.' Then another came, saying, 'Master, here is your mina, which I have kept and put away in a handkerchief. For I feared you, because you are an austere man. You collect what you did not deposit, and reap what you did not sow.' And he said to him, 'Out of your own mouth I will judge you, you wicked servant. You knew that I was an austere man, collecting what I did not deposit, and reaping what I did not sow. Why then did you not put my money into the bank, that at my coming I might have collected it with interest?' And he said to those who stood by, 'Take the mina from him, and give it to him who has 10 minas. But they said to him, 'Master, he has 10 minas.' For I say to you that to everyone who has will be given, and from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. So bring here those enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, and slay them before me." Now, this is an interesting story, and I'll be honest with you, over the years when I've read this, I've often wondered, there's some other stories about the master giving talents to his servants, and that seems a little more clear-cut. This one's a little more complicated, and so I've kind of steered away from this story, but there are several truths, I think, that are very important to notice from this parable. And the first one is simply that the master entrusts something valuable to every servant. And I think that's important to realize, that every servant is entrusted with something. And of course, in our life, God has entrusted many different things to us as well. And the story of this parable is going to be, what have you done with what God has entrusted to you? You might not think that you've been entrusted with much. You might not be wealthy. You might not have a lot of responsibility at work. You may not have a large family. But we never have to look very far before we begin to notice those things God has entrusted to us. And then notice, though, it also says that the master expected the servants to grow what they had been given. And this is very important. It's something that lately God has been convicting me to meditate upon. God expects you to multiply, to grow whatever it is God entrusts to you. And we're going to look at what that looks like very practically in just a moment. But God doesn't want you to remain the same. Whatever God gives you, he doesn't want, obviously, to come back 5 years later and find that nothing has changed, that everything is just like it was when he left. He expects you to grow and multiply whatever it is he puts in your hands. You notice also that in the parable, everyone is given the same amount. They're all given 10 minas, which would have been about 3 months' wages. And now, we know that in life, we're not all given necessarily the same amount of talents, the same amount of abilities. We're gifted differently. We're not made the same. But we all have the resources of heaven available to us. It's not that God just chooses to bless me, but doesn't want to bless you. It's not that God wants to give me all the power of heaven and make it available to me, but he's too busy to help you. We all have the very same God who wants to help us, and will go to the storerooms of heaven to supply you with whatever it is he wants you to do. And then notice finally that all the servants had the very same challenges. Now, something I had not noticed before, there's something that always troubled me about this parable, is that, of course, the nobleman represents Jesus. And Jesus says that the nobleman went away to receive his kingdom. And, of course, Jesus, after he's resurrected from the dead, he goes back to the right hand of the Father. But we know that eventually he's going to be returning in his second coming and establishing then formally and officially and fully his kingdom. And so we're in a waiting period for Jesus to return. And here the parable says that the nobleman went to a far country. So in other words, it's going to be a while till he returns. And so he as he returns, though, or as they're waiting for him to return, it says something interesting. It says, but the citizens of that kingdom, they didn't want him. They hated that nobleman. And they actually sent a delegation to the powers that be to say, we don't want him to be our king. Now, every time I read that, I always thought, well, that just doesn't reflect well on Jesus. I mean, this is Jesus they're talking about. So to say everybody hates him and doesn't want him to rule, that seems kind of harsh. I don't know if I like reading that about Jesus. But lately, as I've thought more about that, I realized, but that does describe society today. People don't want Jesus to rule over their life. Societies don't want to follow the rules that Jesus set down. They don't want to have the standards of the Bible and to be measured and have their life evaluated based on how closely they follow God's teaching and his words. We might want to acknowledge Jesus as a nice person, but we don't want him to rule over us. We want to rule over ourselves. We want the freedom to do what we want. And so we live in a society that is filled with people that want nothing to do with Jesus, or certainly don't want Jesus telling them what to do. And so imagine if you're one of these servants and you're told, now go out into the society and do business and try to make money for the person everybody hates. So go to another company and say, I'd like to do business with you. Oh, what company are you? Well, I do business for that nobleman. Oh, I hate him. I don't want him to be successful. Imagine what that would be like, trying to do business in a land where everyone hates your boss, where everyone wants your boss to fail, not to succeed. And then try to imagine how difficult it would be to do business in a society where no one wants you to be successful. That takes creativity. That takes entrepreneurship. It's not easy. It's difficult. You've got to be creative to figure out, how can I grow a business in a land where everyone hates the person who owns my business? And that's what the nobleman had asked these servants to do. And so when he returns eventually, he asks for an accounting. And of course, the first servant comes and says, you gave me 10 minutes. I've earned 10 more. I've doubled what you've given me. And of course, for you to double your investment, you're not being a modest investor. You're not playing it safe. You're gambling, in a sense. You're taking risks. You're in danger of losing everything to double your investment. The next person got a 50% return, which for any investor, they'd be thrilled with that kind of return. And again, they had to be investing aggressively. They had to be working hard to get that kind of return. But then the third servant came, and he unfolded his handkerchief, and he returns the mina. He says, look, I didn't lose a thing. And of course, the problem with this servant was he was more concerned about losing than he was concerned about gaining. He wasn't focusing on getting more. He was just trying to hold on to what he had and not lose anything in the process. And I found that in the church today, there are many churches that are far more concerned about not losing than they are concerned with gaining, with advancing. And God never rewards people for not losing. God rewards people for advancing, for gaining, for increasing, for multiplying. And you will never multiply what God has given you by standing still, by playing it safe. And so just in these last moments, let me just apply that to you for a moment. And I was originally scheduled to be with you over this weekend so that I could be in a retreat with the men. And so I want to talk to all of you, but certainly to the men as in particular, I want to ask you, so what has God entrusted to you? What has God put into your hands? What will God ask you to give an account for one day? And one of those, if you're married, God's going to ask you to give an account for your marriage. And if you have children, God's going to ask you to give an account for your family, for the children that I gave you. How did you multiply? How did you enrich? How did you bless those things? Folks, I've known some people who've been married for 40 years, and their marriage today is basically just like it was 40 years ago. I know couples who have the same habits, the same routines, the same vacations, the same schedules that they've had for decades. Nothing has changed. Nothing is fresh. Nothing is new. It's always the same. And God would look at that and say, in 40 years, you didn't do anything to grow your marriage. It's not any more intimate, more joyful, more productive, more fruitful. You never took the initiative to look at your marriage and say, God, what could I do to enhance it and make it better? You see, that's the kind of steward that God's looking for. People that look at anything God puts in their hands and says, oh God, by your power and by your grace, how could this be made better than the way you gave it to me in the first place? I know just in my own marriage, at times I can be in the same rut as everybody. You get busy, you're rushing about, and you begin to take your spouse for granted. But now and then, it's just so refreshing when God just leads you to say, well, why don't you try this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you take your wife on this business trip with you? You're going to a fun place. Why don't you stay an extra day or two and enjoy the scenery? A couple years ago, my wife and I, we felt led to start a new Sunday school class, a Bible study for single adults. And we enlisted my daughter and son-in-law to help us co-teach that. And it was just something new, and it was something we did together. I travel the world ministering, but this was something I could do with my wife. And she is just wonderful at loving on these single adults. And all of a sudden, instead of just going to church and just receiving worship and ministry, we were going to church carrying all kinds of gifts and baking and supplies and decorations and doing this together. And it became a refreshing thing that we could do together. A couple years ago, we began running. She's a much better runner than I am. But it was something that we could do and encourage one another as we set new goals and we ran greater distances and we could enter some contests. This year, my younger son, Daniel, and my wife and I, we entered a running club where we have a goal of, between the three of us, we're trying to run 2,000 miles. I'm not sure that we're going to make that, but it's fun to be running with my wife and my son. as a 3-member team trying to run 2,000 miles in a year. It's just something new. It's just something different. It's just my wife and I just saying, let's not just go through another year where everything in our marriage was exactly the same. It's the same with our kids. There's times where we need to look at each of our kids as they grow up and to say, God, you bless me with these children, but how might my relationship with my child be enhanced? And how might it grow? How might it be better than it was a year ago? I was talking to a man one time. He was an outdoors person. He loved hunting and fishing and any kind of outdoor activities. His son, his only son, just liked to play computer games, didn't like to go outdoors, didn't like to hunt or fish. And so my friend had really no relationship with his son. And we were talking about that one day, and he was bemoaning the fact that and he just said, I have nothing in common with my son. And I looked at him and said, well, get something in common with your son. Your son is what you have in common. You love your son. I remember with my son Daniel that spent some time there in your church. He was a person that loved computer games, and quite frankly, I didn't really care for them. But I began playing computer games for one reason, so that I could spend time with my son. He'd beat me every solitary time. I don't think I ever beat him in a game. But and sometimes at one time he kind of looked at me and said, Dad, why do you always play this? You're not that good. You always lose. And I remember just looking at him and saying, because I get to spend time with you. And I enjoy spending time with you. Folks, I tell you, you got to look at the relationships God's given you, whether it's a friendship, whether it's a relationship to a child, a relationship to a spouse, and ask, God, you've entrusted this relationship with me. How could it be better? How could you enhance it? How could you enrich it? I don't want to get to the end of another year and have the very same relationship with my spouse, with my kids, with my friends that I've had for years now. A wise steward looks at whatever God's put in his hands and says, so God, how could this be better? Well, also God does that with the church. And COVID-19 has certainly tested the church these days. And for many people and many churches, I'm familiar with many churches across the United States and across the world, and many churches are like the third servant. They're just trying to hold on. They're just waiting and waiting for the day when they can get back to things as they used to be. We just want everything to go back to normal, they would say. And of course, that's what the third servant was wanting to do. He was just holding on, waiting for the master to come back and life to get back to normal. I'll just give him back his 10 minutes and everything will be fine. I won't have to worry about a thing. But that's not what God's looking for. And what I've discovered is that with every problem, there's also a possibility. And some people, all they focus on is the problem. They focus on, well, we can't meet right now. We can't go to the church building and have services. And they just fixate on what they can't do. But there are other leaders who will look at the very same situation and say, but what new possibilities are there? What can we do now that we couldn't do before? There are people now that are asking questions about life and death. They're concerned about catching COVID-19. They're not sure that they're ready to die today if they were to catch that terrible disease. And whereas before they didn't want to talk about the life to come. They didn't want to talk about heaven or God. All of a sudden, they do have an interest, and they do have some questions. And there's a spiritual openness that wasn't there before. And I'm seeing some churches that are saying, we are in a hostile environment. People don't like our king. They don't like the noble whose business we're doing business for. But God expects us to grow it. God expects us to expand it. So let's look for possibilities. I heard of one church that when they could no longer meet physically, they began to start a live stream service so that people could watch it on the internet. And they told me that on Easter Sunday, they had 10 times as many people watch their Easter service as they normally had come physically to be in the building. And they said, we realize that some of those are maybe not watching the whole thing. They're just maybe catching a part of the service. But they said, we touched 10 times more people than we would have touched if we'd just done things the way that we always did. My oldest son is a church planter, and his church is had been only meeting for about a year or so. And so when all of a sudden they were told you can't meet, his church was not very strong yet. They'd only been meeting for a year, but his wife began cranking out homemade bread. And my son would take this homemade bread right out of the bread maker, and they'd put some different other gifts in a basket and so on, a bag, and he would go to various church people that belonged to his fellowship and ring the doorbell. He'd stand out on the street, the sidewalk, a safe distance away. And when they opened the door and they could smell this warm bread wafting up to them, he would just say, I wish we could meet physically, but I just wanted you to know we haven't forgotten you. We love you. We care about you. Well, I'll tell you what, these people have said, I've gone to church all my life. I've never had my pastor bring homemade bread to my door before, but as soon as we can meet again, I know where I'm going, because this is a church that cares about me. I know people that have ministered to senior adults that were not able or were afraid to go to stores and to pick food up, and the church just said, listen, we want to be here for you. We want to help meet a need in your life. And all of a sudden, the church had all kinds of new opportunities to love people, to minister to people that the church hadn't had before. Instead of focusing on what they couldn't do, the church looked and said, but look at all the new opportunities we have now to let people know about the love of God for their life. And then certainly just in your own relationship with God. God has entrusted to you a walk with Him. And you need to look at your walk with God to say, I've been walking with God now a whole year longer than I had before. Is my walk with God today any better than it was a year ago? Is my prayer life any better now than it was a year ago? God, when He began walking with me and saved me 20 years ago, I've had 20 years now of a relationship with God. What should my relationship look like after 20 years of being a steward of my walk with God? What should my prayer life be like? And you can begin to look and say, has God done anything fresh and new in my relationship with Him since I became a Christian? Or am I having the same quiet times I've had for years? Am I praying the same way I have for years? Do I worship God exactly the same way I have for years? Or is it about time for God to expand something in my walk with Him, to take something in my relationship with God deeper than it's been before? I've been a Christian now for 50 years. And it's easy to get into ruts. It's easy just to do the same things over and over again. It just becomes comfortable. But it's always fun when God helps inspire some new ideas. By the way, I've had people tell me that sometimes they just find spending time with God to be boring, of all things. And I'll look at people, and when they're being honest, they'll just say, sometimes I just find reading my Bible, praying, having a quiet time, I struggle sometimes. I just find it kind of boring. And my first response is, well, then God can't be in charge of your quiet times. Because I can promise you, if God is arranging a meeting with you, it's not going to be boring. Look anywhere in the Bible where someone encountered God, it was never boring. They were on their face, trembling in awe. They left God's presence. They were never the same again. And so if it's you that is arranging a boring quiet time, well, then you need to arrange something better. Over the years, I've tried different things. I remember for years, I would have a journal. And as I read my Bible, I'd write down in my journal the things that I saw God saying in His Word. But then when it came to my praying, I would just pray whatever came into my mind. And one day it just dawned on me, why am I not writing down my prayers? Now, it's just not been my tradition to write my prayers out before, but I began to write out some prayers, and it was very rich. You're actually seeing in black and white exactly what it is you're asking God to do. And then you can go back, and I find that my mind did not wander as much as I was praying when I'm writing out my thoughts, very specifically, what is it I want God to do? And then I can go back and I can see that. Well, God blessed me with 6 grandchildren. And when my grandchildren began coming, I learned of an idea that I quickly took hold of, where I got a journal for each of my 6 grandchildren. Nice, most of them leather-covered, hard-covered journals. And I've got their name in each one and pictures of them through the years. And then I've just written out my prayers for each of those grandchildren. And when I see one of them and I see something that God's doing in their little lives, I'll go back to that journal and I'll write a prayer and an observation. And for instance, I've got two twins, twin grandsons, Emerson and Logan. And the other day, their mother brought out their pajamas to get ready for bed. And Emerson got his, a top and a bottom that matched. He put them on. But Logan is kind of the emotional child, and he had mismatched pajamas. His mother couldn't find the matching top and bottom, so she just gave him a top and a bottom. He's 5 years old. He just needs to go to bed. But he burst into tears with the humiliation of having to wear pajamas to bed that didn't match. And he's sobbing and upset. Of course, you can kind of roll your eyes and say, this is silliness. You'll just be in bed with the light off. Who cares? But Emerson, the older brother, by 2 minutes, saw his brother in tears, looked down at his matching pajamas, and he began to just peel off his matching pajamas, handed them to his younger brother in tears, and said, I'll wear your pajamas. And he put on these unmatching pajamas. Well, when I heard that story, I went and pulled out Emerson's prayer journal. And I kind of summarized what he had done. I said, God, he's only 5, but already he has a generous heart, a generous spirit. He's the kind of person that just wants to make things better for others. And I pray, God, that you'll just use him his whole life to be a blessing to other people. Will he always have a generous heart to give what he can to make other people's lives better? And I'm counting on, assuming that when they're 18 or 20, maybe when they get married, at some point as young adults, I'm going to hand these boys each of those prayer journals, and they'll be able to look out the first quarter or so of their life, all the prayers and observations that their grandfather had for them. And I'll tell you what, that makes your quiet time, that makes your prayer time a lot more exciting when you realize this isn't just a ritual I'm going through. One day my grandson's going to read these prayers and know what was in my heart for him years ago when they didn't even know what was going on. I'll tell you what, whatever God puts in your heart, whatever God puts in your life, one day God's going to say, so what did you do with what I gave you? With your walk with me, with your relationship with your spouse, with your relationship with your children, with your friends, with the way you serve me in the church. Are you doing the same thing you've always done? Or have you just sort of put your creativity, your entrepreneurship at work and asked God, how could I take what you've given me and one day show you that there's twice as much now as there was when you gave me? Oh, I pray that for each of you in the years to come, you'll also hear your master say, well done, good and faithful servant. It's been great to be with you. I hope that I'll be able to see you soon, and I'll be excited to hear from you how God multiplied what he put in your life many times over and made you a blessing to everyone around your life.